Growing up, Richard Hanchett heard stories about his biological mother, how beautiful she was, with red hair and blue eyes, and how much she loved singing. Just a really nice person, Mr. Hanchett, 64, said. But he never met Ruth Marie Terry. She chose to have him adopted right after he was born in 1958, entrusting him to a couple who worked with her at a plant that made door panels and seat covers for cars in Livonia, Michigan. She was 21 at the time. In 2018, hoping to find her, Mr. Hanchett, who lives in Waterford, Michigan, took a DNA test through Ancestry.com and met her family in Tennessee. That's when he learned that she had been missing since the early 1970s and that her relatives there had been searching for her for decades. On Monday, October 31, 2022, the family finally learned what had happened to her when the FBI announced that a badly mutilated body found nearly 50 years ago in the dunes of Provincetown, Massachusetts, was that of Miss Terry, who was 37 and originally from Tennessee. On Wednesday, November 2, 2022, the authorities announced a new development in the investigation, saying that they were seeking information about a man, now deceased, named Guy Rockwell Moldovan, whom Miss Terry was believed to have married shortly before she was murdered. Mr. Moldovan, born in 1923, was a former antiques dealer who was arrested in 1960 in connection with the disappearance of his former wife and her daughter after mutilated remains, believed to be theirs, were found in their Seattle home. Mr. Moldovan was given a suspended sentence in the case and was freed in 1962. Court records indicate that Mr. Moldovan married Miss Terry in Reno, Nevada, in February 1974, just months before she was killed. Miss Terry's nephew Jim Terry said that the last time he had seen Miss Terry was in July or August of 1973, in a motel room in Chattanooga, Tennessee, with Mr. Moldovan. His mother thought she was going to California, and his father thought she was headed up north, Mr. Terry said. We never heard from her again, said Mr. Terry, 60, adding, I was a kid. I just remember a big smile and her auburn hair. Miss Terry's family later learned about Mr. Moldovan's connection to the disappearance of his wife and her daughter in Seattle. It sure gave me the chills when I read that, Mr. Hanchett said. Last week, at the request of investigators, he submitted a DNA sample to confirm that the body found in Provincetown was that of his biological mother. I couldn't believe when I found out who she was, he said on Tuesday, one day after officials had briefed him on the breakthrough at an FBI office in Troy, Michigan. And now I'm finding out where she was and what happened. Miss Terry's nude body was found on a beach blanket on Race Point Beach on July 26, 1974, by a girl who was hiking with her family. Miss Terry's hands were missing, presumably removed by her killer so she could not be identified with fingerprints, and her nearly severed head rested on folded jeans, the FBI said. Investigators said she had been killed by a blow to the head, probably several weeks earlier. Detectives canvassed motels and rooming houses, reviewed thousands of reports of missing women, checked every vehicle licensed to drive on the dunes and used clay models to recreate what she might have looked like. But they were unable to identify the woman they called the Lady of the Dunes, and her case haunted a generation of investigators and Cape Cod residents. She was said by the FBI to have been the oldest unidentified homicide victim in Massachusetts. As the trail went cold, some speculated that she had been killed by the notorious South Boston gangster James Whitey Bulger. The writer Joe Hill, a son of Stephen King, believed she might have been an extra from the movie Jaws, which was filmed on nearby Martha's Vineyard that year. In 2000, the authorities exhumed her remains from a cemetery in Provincetown to extract a DNA sample. But it wasn't until recently that they were able to identify her through genetic genealogy, the same technique that was used to identify the Golden State Killer, among many others. At a news conference on Monday, law enforcement officials said they were now turning their attention to finding Ms. Terry's killer by tracing her history and asking the public for tips. They did not mention Mr. Moldovan. He died in 2002 at age 78 in Salinas, California, according to an obituary in the Monterey County Herald. It's very likely that the person who did this is dead, Michael D. O'Keefe, the district attorney for Cape Cod, Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, told reporters. But they may not be, and so the message to them if they're still out there is, we're coming. Miss Terry grew up in Whitwell, Tennessee, about 24 miles northwest of Chattanooga, and left home when she was a teenager, Mr. Terry said. By the time she reached Livonia, Michigan, she had been married once and separated, and was known as Ruth Smith, Mr. Hanchett said. She lived in California in the 1960s, Mr. Terry said, and then returned to Tennessee. Mr. O'Keefe said there was no information to suggest that Miss Terry had ever been reported to the authorities as a missing person. But Mr. Terry said that his sister, Marilyn Renee Hill, who died last year, had used genealogical websites and DNA tests to conduct her own investigation. "My sister was kind of hellbent on trying to find her," he said, even in the later years. Mr. Hanchett, a retired software engineer for General Motors, said that he had helped Ms. Hill, searching online for names and addresses she would give him. Mr. Hanchett said that Miss Terry had tried to contact him once when he was about 13, but he rejected her overture, which he deeply regrets. He said he hoped to have her reburied next to her parents in Tennessee. "Everybody that I talked to who knew her adored her," he said. "I wish I could have just talked to her, touched her once." For decades, the murder of a 30-year-old woman whose body was found along I-10 in the middle of the desert went unsolved. But advances in DNA technology have allowed some semblance of closure for Sherry Herrera's for children with news of an arrest of a man believed to be the murder suspect. Herrera was only 6 years old on March 30, 1993. That's the day the body of his mother was found dumped at the I-10 exit of Hayfield Road near Desert Center. It's a day Herrera said he'll never forget. Sherry Herrera was from Tulare County in the Central Valley. So how did her body end up alongside a freeway in the Southern California desert, about halfway between Palm Springs and the Arizona state line? That remained a mystery to investigators. In the early 1990s, the processing and testing of DNA evidence was still in its infancy, but Hestron said because investigators were so diligent in processing the scene, it allowed their cold case unit the opportunity to reopen the murder investigation about a year ago. Hestron didn't specifically address what they found that allowed them to crack the case, but said potential DNA evidence from the murderer found at the crime scene matched DNA evidence found at another murder crime scene in the state of Texas. That murder was committed in 1992. The suspect in the Texas murder case and person of interest in the Herrera case has been identified as 68-year-old Douglas Thomas. At the time of the murders, Hestron said he was a long-haul truck driver. Now retired, Texas authorities said he was arrested on suspicion of murder at his home in Waco. Adrian Herrera said investigators told him that the DNA match that led authorities to Thomas didn't come from Thomas himself. Herrera was allegedly killed during the commission of a rape. According to prosecutors, potential DNA from the killer discovered at Herrera's crime scene matched DNA found at the Titus County murder scene. Authorities said Thomas will be prosecuted in Texas first, and then Riverside prosecutors will request that he be extradited back to California to face his charges in Herrera's murder. After more than 3 decades of questions and grief, Tamika Reyes finally knows who killed her mother. Anna Kane was 26 when her body was found on October 23, 1988, in a wooded area near Reading, Pennsylvania, with baling twine around her neck. An investigation revealed she'd been strangled elsewhere and dumped in the woods. A local newspaper, the Reading Eagle, ran a front-page story seeking information on Kane's death. In February 1990, about 15 months after she was killed, the paper received an anonymous letter from a concerned citizen with information that only the killer would know, police said. The letter writer also left his DNA when he licked the envelope. The DNA from the saliva matched what was found on Kane's clothing, authorities said in August 2022. But years turned into decades, and police still didn't know who the suspect was. Finally, in 2022, Pennsylvania State Police used genetic genealogy testing to identify the killer, a local man named Scott Grimm. Now Reyes finally has some answers, although she's sad for her grandmother, who died before learning the case was solved. For 34 years, Reyes, along with her 2 brothers and their grandmother, have wondered who killed Kane. The lack of closure has added to the distress of losing their mother.
Her family now has many questions that will remain unanswered, and they want the public to know who she was to them.
She was a person. She was my mother. She was Lovick and Michael's mother. We loved her. We still do, and you know, she never got the opportunity to make a change.
Then Reyes got a call in August of 2022 from a detective about a stunning development in the case. After years of waiting for justice, she was relieved investigators finally had named her mother's killer. But she was disappointed to learn that Grimm had died in 2018 of natural causes at age 58 and will not pay for robbing her and her siblings of a childhood with a mother. Reyes was 9 when her mother was killed, and said she thinks about her every day. Reyes said one of her fondest childhood memories was taking walks with her mother and seeing her suddenly dance to random music playing in stores as they passed. After her death, Reyes' aunt took her in and raised her while her 2 brothers moved in with their father. Reyes said she's still bothered by the image the media painted of her mother, who was unemployed at the time of her death. Although her mother had a dark past that included drug use and prostitution, she was trying to turn her life around. Reyes added she was portrayed as this slain prostitute, like she deserved what happened to her. She was more than that, she was a victim. She was a mother. She was loved. No one deserves what happened to her. Investigators said they identified Grimm as the killer using genetic genealogy, which combines DNA evidence and traditional genealogy to find biological connections among people. In recent years, companies like 23andMe and Ancestry have encouraged people to explore their genealogy by spitting into a tube and sending it off for analysis. These companies then send back information on their clients' ethnic heritage, genetic health risks and family tree, as well as a raw data file of their DNA. With millions of users seeking to explore their genetic roots, the practice has become a big business. It's also become a valuable tool for law enforcement officers trying to solve old crimes. DNA collected from crime scenes can now be uploaded to an online service that compares it to DNA submitted by people using companies like 23andMe to explore their genealogy. If a possible match is found, genealogists can build out family trees to help police find potential suspects. In recent years, this method has helped solve some of the nation's most high-profile cold cases. Investigators analyzed Kane's clothing and found traces of an unknown man's DNA. They later determined that it matched the DNA on the envelope from 1990, confirming investigators' belief that the person behind the letter was the killer. But while investigators had Grimm's DNA profile, there was nothing to identify him because he had never been arrested for anything that required his DNA to be put into the system, authorities said. That's where genetic genealogy came in. Genetic genealogy's effectiveness in cold cases depends on the quality of crime scene DNA and whether it has degraded, State Police Trooper Daniel Woolmer said at a news conference in 2022. The detective's careful preservation of DNA evidence in 1988 provided a solid foundation for today's investigators to examine with new technology, Pennsylvania State Police Sergeant Nathan Trate said at the news conference. Investigators don't know much about Grimm other than he lived in the nearby Hamburg, Pennsylvania, area. They're trying to determine whether he knew Kane, and have urged anyone who knows the nature of their relationship to reach out. So far, they've found no ties. Kane was reportedly working as a prostitute at the time she was killed and may have been meeting a customer, Woolmer said, adding that police are trying to determine whether it was Grimm. The Pennsylvania State Police have declined to release the 1990 letter to the newspaper or to elaborate on exactly what it said. Woolmer said there was just intimate details about where she was disposed of, how her clothes were displayed, stuff like that. This led investigators to believe that whoever wrote the letter had committed the homicide. Investigators said the biggest breakthrough in the case happened last year after they obtained a new sample of Grimm's DNA to compare with the older evidence. They declined to elaborate how they obtained his DNA when he's been dead for 4 years. Now that they have identified Grimm's DNA, police will review other open cold cases to see if he was involved, Womer said. Meanwhile, Reyes still misses her mother. Reyes said it has been hard growing up without a mom. No child should ever have to grow up without their mom. Reyes still has so many questions she'd ask Grimm if he was still alive. Why did he kill a young woman who was just trying to take care of her children? And what went through his mind when he learned she had a family that loved her? Reyes knows she'll never get the answers. But she's glad her family finally knows her mother's killer.
A Zenith Ducat was killed on her way home from school back in 1980. 10 TV's Brittany Bailey reports on the long wait for answers. It's a case she's been researching for nearly 2 years.
The death of a Zenith Ducat here in this Upper Arlington community made an impact that lasted for decades, and now police say her case is finally solved.
We have closed the Ducat murder case.
That was the announcement from Upper Arlington Police on Thursday. More than 40 years after a Zenith Ducat was murdered on her way home from school, police are officially naming her accused killer.
After 42 years, Upper Arlington police say they have identified a suspect in the death of 8-year-old Zenith Ducat, whose homicide has been one of the area's most infamous unsolved cases. On Thursday, Upper Arlington Police posted an update on their website, saying that DNA technology advancements have helped them identify Brent Stagner as the suspect in the case. Stagner died by suicide in June 1984 at the age of 24. On June 3, 1980, Ducat left Barrington Elementary School and started the approximately 1-mile walk to her home on Malvern Road, but she never got there. About 4 hours after she was reported missing, Upper Arlington police said Ducat's body was found in a shallow stream at the mouth of a culvert near First Community Village. A 20-pound limestone rock had been used to hit her in the head, police said. Her death, which remained unsolved for more than 4 decades, rocked the Upper Arlington community. Over the years, police identified more than a dozen people as possible suspects for investigation, and hypnotized a number of people in attempts to solve the case. In the end, it was DNA that led police to the person they believe was the killer. Police said Stagner was a 1979 graduate of Upper Arlington High School and had been living near Upper Arlington when Ducat was killed. In 2008, police received information about a DNA profile being recovered from evidence collected in the case that matched Stagner. Detectives then re-examined every other piece of evidence to determine if Stagner acted alone or with anyone else, but found no DNA to implicate anyone else. Around the time of Ducat's death, a number of young females were attacked, including an attempt to abduct a young girl on Henderson Road. That attack, Upper Arlington police said, was only months after Ducat's homicide and was made by a man who associated with Stagner. That man, who served time in prison for the attempted abduction, also was investigated as being involved in Ducat's death. Police said the division was unable to discover sufficient evidence to also link him to the murder of a Zenith. Detectives also re-interviewed a number of witnesses and people of interest to determine if any other evidence would come to light. The division is confident that all investigative leads have been exhausted. Sergeant Brian McKean said police interviewed nearly 1,000 witnesses over the more than 40 years of investigation. He said that while police had a DNA profile matching Stagner in 2008, they did not want to release information publicly until they were absolutely certain they had answers. He added, "We wanted to make sure all the pieces and parts were tied together before we released anything." Stagner was a suspect long before we had the ability to identify him. Police Chief Steve Farmer said the department has worked tirelessly for years to solve the case. Members of the Long Walk Home, the Zenith Ducat Project, said in a statement that Thursday's press release from Upper Arlington only confirmed what they've known and shared through their project since its inception in 2019. The case may be closed by the city of Upper Arlington, but it is far from closed for us, the group said in a statement. We applaud the countless hours and hard work that lead to the confirmation of Brent Stagner's involvement in the crime. However, after viewing the totality of the evidence, it is reasonable to conclude Brent Stagner did not act alone. Our mission will continue based on that belief, and as long as the Ducat family and our community continue to support our efforts to bring all involved to justice. Sergeant McKean said being able to give the Ducat family answers after more than 4 decades has been bittersweet. He added, "This case is all about sadness. For the officers who worked on it, they'll carry it with them forever. This is one of those cases that haunts you." McKean said the case also spoke to the strength of the community in Upper Arlington. Many residents participated in searches for Ducat when she was reported missing, and have cooperated with the investigation through the years while holding out hope that the case would be solved. "Every person involved wanted to get to this point," he said. "We hope it brings some little bit of peace to the Ducat family." Bittersweet is also how Leslie Lyon, a friend of Ducat's, described hearing the news. Lyon was 9 years old when her childhood friend was murdered. The two often played jump rope at recess and were in the same Sunday school class at Our Lady of Victory Church in Marble Cliff. Sometimes the girls walked home together, but Lyon was already on her way by the time Ducat's class was excused that day. She said, "It's still hard to talk about. For most of us who lived through it, there's been so much speculation over the years that it doesn't really bring closure. The hardest part," Lyon said, "is knowing that Stagner is also dead because it means there will be no justice." In April 2009, the teen from New York came down to Myrtle Beach for spring break. She was last seen outside the Blue Water Resort on Ocean Boulevard, and then she vanished. It wasn't until 13 years later, when a stunning confession in May 2022 brought closure to a case that haunted the Grand Strand for 13 years, the disappearance of Brittany Drexel, a man named Raymond Moody, who was once a person of interest in the case, came forward and confessed that he had raped, kidnapped and killed Drexel the very night that she disappeared. Raymond Moody, 62, a longtime person of interest in the case, said in court after entering his guilty plea. He said, "I was a monster then, and I was a monster when I took Brittany Drexel's life. I don't have the words to express how horrible I feel. I'm very sorry." The judge sentenced Moody to consecutive terms of 30 years on the charges of kidnapping and criminal sexual conduct and a life sentence on the first-degree murder charge for kidnapping, raping and strangling the 17-year-old high school soccer star who dreamed of becoming a nurse or cosmetologist. In his victim statement to the court before Moody was sentenced, Drexel's stepfather, Chad Drexel, who with her mother, Dawn Plecken, searched tirelessly for the teen, said he'd always held out hope that she would be one day found. 13 years later, I find out the horrible and disgusting way she was murdered, he said, choking back tears. Plecken had harsher words for Moody. "I hope you suffer in prison for the rest of your useless life," said Plecken, who never stopped looking for her daughter. For more than a decade, Drexel's parents wondered what happened to the outgoing junior at Gates Chile High School in Chile, New York. Unbeknownst to her parents, on April 22, 2009, Drexel joined a group of friends who were going to Myrtle Beach for spring break. "I didn't know she was going," Plecken previously told People. "The day she left she was angry with me because she asked me if she could go and I told her no. I said, there's no adults going, and I have no idea who these kids are and I don't feel comfortable with it." Plecken added, "I told her I just felt something was going to happen to her." On April 25, 2009, Drexel left her hotel alone and headed to the Blue Water Resort on Ocean Boulevard, the busy main drag in Myrtle Beach, to visit a friend who was staying there. She was last seen at about 8:45 p.m. when surveillance cameras captured her leaving the hotel in a black and white tank top, shorts and flip-flops, say authorities. She texted her boyfriend back home that she was walking back to the Bar Harbor, a motor and a mile and a half down the road, where she and her friends were staying. She was never heard from again. Her cell phone transmitted its last known signal the day after she disappeared near the South Santee River, between McClellanville and Georgetown, say authorities. For years, local authorities and the FBI searched for her, holding press conferences along the way asking for the public's help. In May of this year, her body was finally found buried in the South Carolina woods. Details about what happened to Drexel when she vanished were finally revealed when police arrested Moody that month, after he directed them to the spot where he'd buried her body. The day after Drexel vanished, police in the nearby town of Surfside stopped Moody for speeding, according to the arrest warrant, but authorities would not identify him as a potential person of interest in the case for another 2 years. Moody was living an hour from Myrtle Beach at a motel in Georgetown, South Carolina, in 2009 when Drexel was last seen, investigators said. According to authorities, Moody kidnapped Drexel as she walked alone along the Myrtle Beach Strip. Thanks to advances in cell phone technology, starting in 2019, authorities were able to track Drexel's phone, showing that she went from walking on the strip to traveling in a car and ending up in the Georgetown County area, Assistant Solicitor Scott Hickson explained in court. The case came to a head in April 2022 when Moody's girlfriend, Angel Voss, agreed to help the FBI and wear a wire and talk to Moody about what happened to Drexel. On May 5, 2022, Moody admitted what he did to Drexel, Hickson said. He told authorities he and Voss were driving in Myrtle Beach when they saw Drexel and asked her to party with them, Hickson said. He said she got into the car voluntarily, which her family disputed. He said he drove Voss and Drexel to a campsite in Georgetown County, where they smoked marijuana. When Voss left, Moody said he wanted to have sex with Drexel. When she refused, he raped her. Worried that he might get in trouble for raping Drexel, he strangled her, wrapped her body in a blanket and hid her in the woods, Hickson said. When Voss returned, he told her Drexel's friends had picked her up. He returned to the campsite later on, moved Drexel's body and buried it in another location. Moody is a registered sex offender who spent 21 years in prison following a 1983 abduction and rape case in California involving a 9-year-old girl. The guilty plea and sentencing are bittersweet for Drexel's family. I'll never be able to walk Brittany down the aisle and neither will her blood father or Dawn, Chad Drexel said. She'll never be able to see my granddaughter, her niece who is amazing, all that's snatched away from us. On March 29, 1983, a man was walking his dog on the banks of the San Lorenzo River on the 200 block of Woodland Drive in Ben Lomond, California, when he saw a body floating in the river. She only wore one nylon, a black boot, and a string of pearls. A navy blue cape was found nearby. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the crime scene, finding several other pieces of evidence. They quickly identified the woman as Joette Marie Smith. She was 33 and the owner of a popular local restaurant called Buffalo Gals. Joette was described as a remarkable woman, very hospitable, happy, cordial, a woman just full of vigor. She was always there when people needed her. She was last seen on March 27, 1983. Joette closed up the restaurant and went across the street to her studio apartment, which she was sharing with a friend, Rachel Devereaux, at the time. Rachel would stay and work with Joette in the winter months as her 46-acre property would be inaccessible during the winter rainy season. The two women watched the TV show Thunderbirds and ate some popcorn before Joette made some phone calls. Joette said she was tired, and Rachel went to bed. Rachel woke up at 3 a.m. to find Joette not in the apartment. This was common as Joette often went to the restaurant late at night. Detectives would find out that Joette had left the apartment and walked to a local bar to buy cigarettes. She had tried one shop closer to home, but it was closed. So she had walked to Henfling's Inn, a bar in downtown Ben Lomond. A waitress there who knew Joette had offered her a ride home, but she had said it was a lovely night and she wanted to walk. That would be the last known sighting of Joette alive. Detectives believe she might have been stopped on the bridge, which was on her way back home. An autopsy would show that she had been strangled to death and that there may have been a sexual element. Her death was ruled a homicide. There was not much for authorities to go on. They interviewed everyone in Joette's life, talked to people who saw her that night, and came up with nothing. Everyone they spoke to didn't think that Joette had any enemies. Authorities had physical evidence but nothing to compare it to, and DNA testing was not being used yet. Joette had moved to Ben Lomond 10 years before and had been about to celebrate the 8th anniversary of owning the restaurant, and she had been planning a big anniversary celebration. She had moved from Colorado Springs but had attended college in Kansas. She was originally from Omaha, Nebraska, where her family still resided. Her mother brought her remains back to Nebraska, where she now rests. There would be no leads in her case till 1988, when detectives would have a suspect, a man named Eric David Drummond. He had an extensive criminal history in California and Nevada, which included sexual assault. Detectives would learn that Drummond had asked Joette out on a date, and she told him no. Drummond had left California quickly after the murder. They had circumstantial evidence connecting him to the crime, but no case could be brought against him without more physical evidence. Joette's case would eventually go cold. In 2022, her case was reopened in the hopes of using new DNA technology not available in 1983. They were able to get a male DNA sample from the 1983 evidence. In August of 2022, they were able to get a sample of DNA directly from Drummond, now 64 years old. The DNA sample was an exact match for the evidence sample. Unfortunately, while detectives were working on getting an arrest warrant, Drummond committed suicide in September. Though there will not be justice, the friends and family of Joette now have answers. They have also input Drummond's DNA into Cody's and are looking to determine if there are any other cold cases that are linked back to him. Joette's sister said in a statement to the media, "A long time ago I just came to the fact that they probably would never identify her killer." The announcement was a little bit of a letdown, but I don't feel like we didn't get justice. The DNA was a match, and it's closure. A cold case is finally solved nearly 34 years after a young woman was murdered. The FBI has been working with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to use new technology to finally bring the family of Stacy Lynn Kahorsky some peace. This is a historic case. The FBI said this is the first time in the country when both the victim and the killer have been identified by forensic genealogy. Special Agent Joe Montgomery worked on Stacy's case without knowing her name or identity for nearly a decade. He had an old photo of her in black and white, and all this time, he was trying to fill in the blanks. He added, "To me, it's incredible. Because as an agent, you live with these cases." Stacy was 19 years old when she went missing. A body was found in December 1988, but law enforcement weren't able to identify it. In 2005, the DNA was entered as a Jane Doe into the missing persons database. In 2015, her murder was assigned to the cold case unit. In March of 2022, Agent Montgomery finally got to call Stacy's family and tell them she had been identified through forensic genealogy nearly 34 years after her death. In August 2022, her killer was identified the same way. Law enforcement identified the killer as Henry Frederick Wise, who went by Haas and drove a truck all over the Southeast. He also worked as a stunt driver in South Carolina. He was killed in a stunt accident at Myrtle Beach Speedway in 1999 and burned to death, Montgomery said. Wise died before he could face justice for killing Stacy. He died 23 years before Stacy was ever identified. It was traced back. Wise had a living relative who was interviewed, cooperated, and it was matched to Wise, FBI Special Agent in charge Carrie Farley said. Forensic genealogy uses the DNA from the suspect or the victim's living relatives, but Agent Montgomery said it takes investigators to make the connections. Agent Montgomery said, "It's like another lead to run down. It develops a profile, but then you have to go through different relatives and it's almost like a tree and you're working your way back to the trunk." In this case, he said the limbs of that tree lead back to Henry Haas Wise and Stacy Kahorsky. DNA from coffee cup solves 1975 cold case murder of 19-year-old Lindy Sue Beechler. In July 2022, one of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania's oldest cold cases was solved when David Sinopoli, 68, was arrested for the brutal murder of Lindy Sue Beechler. Lindy Sue Beechler was only 19 years old when she was found stabbed to death in her apartment home in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on December 5, 1975. She had been sexually assaulted before being stabbed 19 times in her chest, back, and neck. The young girl also had defensive wounds, showing she fought hard for her life. According to reports, the knife was still in her neck when she was found. Police interviewed as many as 300 people, consulted crime experts, and launched a task force. However, the crime went unsolved for nearly 5 decades. On July 18, 2022, Lancaster County District Attorney Heather Adams announced that a suspect had finally been arrested for Beechler's brutal murder. David Vincent Sinopoli, 68, of East Hempfield Township, Pennsylvania, was charged with criminal homicide. Adams said, "We are here today due to advances in DNA technology." The cold case one was the oldest unsolved ones in the county, and after all those years, a discarded coffee cup helped lead to the arrest. Using DNA evidence collected from the crime scene, genetic genealogist Cece Moore of Parabon Nanolabs determined that Beechler's murderer likely had ancestors from Gasparina, a small town in Italy. Moore then cross-referenced the data with family trees from Lancaster County, and this led her to Sinopoli, who was still living in the same county. Once Sinopoli was on the investigators' radar, authorities started surveilling him for months. When they spotted Sinopoli tossing out a coffee cup at the Philadelphia International Airport, they retrieved it for DNA testing. His DNA was then tested, and it matched the DNA that was found in the victim's underwear. Sinopoli had lived in the same 4-unit building as Beechler. No other known connection between Beechler and the alleged killer has been reported. Sinopoli was arrested at 7 a.m. on July 17, 2022, at his Pennsylvania home. He is now in custody and is being held without bail at Lancaster County Prison. Adams said, Lindy Sue Beechler was 19 when her life was brutally taken away from her 46 years ago in the sanctity of her own home. The arrest of David Sinopoli marks the beginning of the court process, and we hope that it brings some sense of relief to the victims' loved ones and to the community, who for the past 47 years have had no answers. The family members of Ronald Cates, a man accused of killing his friend in Orlando in 1992, came forward to law enforcement to help solve the Orange County cold case, investigators announced during a news conference exactly 30 years to the date of the crime. During the early morning hours of August 10, 1992, deputies responded to a home on North Forsyth Road after the wife of 53-year-old John Stagner found him beaten to death in his bed. Orange County Sheriff John Mina said he had head and facial trauma. Investigators said Stagner was a hard-working maintenance employee for Orange County and was living on the county's maintenance property at the time of his death. The sheriff's office had suspected Cates, who had been a person of interest from the start, committed the crime, but Mina told reporters they didn't have probable cause to make an arrest. Cates reportedly had a drug habit at the time and would often borrow several power tools from Stagner and pawn them to buy drugs. Stagner had reportedly confronted him about it and asked him to return the tools. On the day of the murder, detectives went to his house to speak with him about the case, but he reportedly had his daughter lie and say he wasn't home. Investigators later learned he was hiding under the home that day. They spoke to Cates the following day and again on August 18, 1992, and said there were inconsistencies in the timeline he gave and what his family members were saying. The case kept going, and in 1995 there was a suicidal incident where Cates reportedly admitted to his family that he killed Stagner, the sheriff's office said, but because of how evidence and technology was at the time, there wasn't enough to charge Cates. In 2020, a family member of Cates contacted OCSO about the cold case. The family really cared about this case, even if they were the suspect's family, because Mr. Stagner was very, very good to the Cates family. He would give them money at the time when they needed it or a place to stay, Detective Kevin Wilson told reporters. Detectives started looking into the case some more and spoke to Cates' daughter and wife, and in March 2022, they began more extensive interviews with family members. Wilson said they were in fear of Mr. Cates their whole lives because he was very abusive to them and they were in fear of him. In April 2022, Cates, who was in a hospital in North Carolina, allegedly told a nurse he had killed someone in Florida in 1992. OCSO said she then told a security guard, and they did research, and found the 1992 case on the sheriff's office's website. Officers with the Salisbury Police Department in North Carolina responded to the hospital and obtained Kate's confession on body camera video. The sheriff's office said Cates didn't explain the motive of the murder during his confession. He just explained more or less that he hit Johnny with a stick, Wilson said. Cates reportedly used a walking stick to get around, according to his family, and the stick was found at the crime scene. Detectives said there was enough evidence at that point to be able to interview Cates again and charge him with Stagner's murder. Cates was arrested on August 5 on a first-degree murder charge and is being held in a North Carolina jail, awaiting extradition to Florida. Mina said the sheriff's office started its cold case team in 2020, and since then, the team has solved 13 cases dating back to 1984. After Captain James Tappan Hall was shot to death in Rockville, Maryland in 1971, the mysterious killing remained unsolved for decades. Now, over 50 years later, officers where he worked say they've finally nabbed his killer. Larry David Smith, formerly known as Larry David Becker, 71, was a person of interest from nearly the beginning of the half-century-long quest for justice. He now stands accused, formally, of murder and allegedly confessed to the crime in early September of 2022. Hall was a special deputy sheriff for Montgomery County and is believed to have interrupted a burglary already in progress. At approximately 10:40 p.m. on Saturday, October 23, witnesses entered the Manor Country Club in the 1400 block of Carrollton Road and reported that there was a man lying face down in the southeast parking lot with trauma to his head, the MCPD wrote in a press release last year. Police and fire rescue responded and discovered Captain Hall suffering from a gunshot wound to his head. The victim succumbed to his injuries 3 days later. Becker was initially interviewed by investigators in 1973 but was not officially named as a suspect. Time passed, the case went cold, the file was shelved, and the questions lingered for decades. In October of 2021, the department reopened the case, terming it an ongoing homicide investigation. Those renewed efforts allegedly bore fruit. For almost a year, Detective Leggett and Corporal Killen of the Cold Case Unit combed through case files, recordings, and interviewed witnesses, the MCPD said in a recent press release. Through the course of their investigation, Leggett and Killen narrowed in on one person, Larry David Becker. According to the police department, the cold case investigators learned that Becker began using the last name Smith in 1975 and moved to upstate New York, where he had been living for over 45 years. And after learning that information, it was off to the races. On September 1, 2022, Leggett and Killen interviewed Smith in the Empire State. During that interview, the suspect allegedly confessed to shooting Hall. Later that same day, the detectives applied for and received an arrest warrant that charged Smith with Hall's murder. Smith subsequently waived extradition and will likely be back in Maryland by the end of the September 2022, police said. During a press conference, Montgomery County officials from various agencies praised the detectives' work. They have been dedicated and committed to finding justice, Chief Marcus Jones said. We have never shown that we have given up on finding justice for this case. They have persevered in a manner that demonstrates the high quality of Montgomery County Police. To obtain a confession for someone who committed a crime 51 years ago is a tremendous accomplishment, the chief went on to say. And though the lone suspect is currently charged and in custody, the MCPD says the case is an ongoing investigation and are still asking for the public's help with any additional, relevant details. The apparent solving of Hall's murder is the oldest cold case the department has closed. Lieutenant Kenneth Sanger of the department's Major Crimes Division said the case will now be handed over to the state attorney's office, who intends to take it across the finish line. If you like the video, show your support and subscribe and make sure you click on the bell icon to stay tuned.